And the example I often use for people is like, think about the movie Her, which is like one of the more prominent examples of AI, where you have Joaquin Phoenix talking to this earpiece and it taking actions on his behalf, right? Like
And
he's
you bring up non-API access, something very similar to what Plaid did. Like all banking was not open, and Plaid just
Yep.
kind of like scraped it, which was like gray area of like legality. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone to the podcast. I am Bhavye. I'm with Flow, and we have with us Reed. So, Reed, do you want to give us an introduction?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for having me on, by the way, Bhavye. My name is Reed. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Stytch. We're a customer identity and access management platform, which is just buzzwords for saying we do authentication, sign up and login flows, as well as a number of fraud detection and other features that you'd expect to come along with a system like that.
Wonderful. That was like a lot of heavy words, probably for a lot of the audience. So let's sort of like break down what Stytch does and the amazing things Stytch does. Because when the first time I learned about Stytch, I was like, that's very interesting, but I need to break it down more to understand.
Yeah, no, certainly. The analogy I typically use for Stytch is that most people are familiar at this point with Stripe.
Yeah.
And if you're not, something that every website needs when they are, trying to accept money from customers is the way for them to actually integrate with different payment systems. And so Stripe is a really common vendor people use to make it easy to accept payments online. You use their API or their SDKs, which wrap that API in order to embed it so that when you're on away.com or some other commerce store, when you click buy, that e-commerce company or fintech company doesn't have to build all the payments infrastructure themselves. Now, the reason I use that as an analogy is Stytch is very similar, but we focus on a different side of the problem for people building applications. We focus on the piece about signing up, logging in users, knowing who they are. And so we deal with user authentication, but with that comes a lot of different integrations. So similar to how Stripe makes it easy for you to integrate Apple Pay and Google Pay and a native credit card or maybe bank payments or something like that, we make it really easy for companies to integrate protocol level biometrics like Face ID, Touch ID, sign with Google, sign with Apple, sign with Facebook, email magic links, passwords, things like that. And then we offer a lot of like fraud detection and things like that on top of it. So if you're outsourcing payments to Stripe, you would also likely outsource sign up, login, fraud detection to Stytch.
Authentication. So whenever anyone is trying to log in or sign up, the page that opens up, it says sign with Google, use your SSO or probably a password. That's basically Stytch.
Exactly.
You guys make that extremely simple for like the company that is doing that.
Exactly. Yeah, just a few lines of code to get all of that set up and operating.
Wonderful. So you started this, if I'm correct, in 2020.
Yes. Yep.
So walk me like how like the idea of Stytch came up. What was the process like, and how like you build this into the company?
Yeah, so my co-founder and I, we used to work at a fintech company called Plaid, which is also an API company that makes it easy for people to connect their bank account to Venmo, Coinbase, Robinhood, et cetera. And we both used to work on the authentication team at Plaid. So when you actually went to go through username, password, 2FA, et cetera, flows with Bank of America or Wells Fargo, we were responsible for that user interface. And we first had the idea, I want to say in December 2019, we were catching up over coffee. Juliana, my co-founder and CTO, was an engineer on the authentication team. I ran product. And we were both talking about kind of Juliana had actually, pretty recently moved on to another company called Very Good Security, but we'd both worked together at Plaid, and then she was working on authentication again at Very Good Security. And we were both talking about, the issues we were running into at work. I was talking about, a lot of the same issues she had experienced firsthand around authentication at Plaid, which was, our two biggest issues were one, authentication was our biggest conversion funnel hit. Most users would forget their password. And so we'd lose a large double-digit percentage of users in our funnel, which was the only way we made money, to forgetting their password. And so therefore not, connecting to this budgeting app or not connecting to this Bitcoin app or this stock trading app, whatever it was. And then it was also the number one source of fraud risk, where what we would find is that Best Buy or Target, some other really large company, would have a massive data breach. A lot of those users had reused the same password with Wells Fargo, Bank of America, et cetera. So we'd see bot attacks, credential stuffing aimed at stealing that person's bank account with the presumption that they'd use the same credentials as a lower security app like Best Buy. And so we were talking about this. I was kind of catching Juliana up with some of the latest pieces we'd run into and saying that we had just tried to use a company called Auth0, which is owned by Okta, and how frustrating it was, how we had to dump the integration because it just could not do what we needed it to do as we were trying to embed higher converting, more secure methods like biometrics, other passwordless methods, et cetera, into our authentication flow. And Juliana was saying, I'm actually actively ripping out Auth0 from our system at very good security because we've become so frustrated by how inflexible it was. And that was actually the reason I used that Stripe analogy earlier, is that was actually the first analogy that we used ourselves in December 2019 is, there's a lot of vendors in authentication as a service. Why do none of them feel like Stripe for authentication? And what we meant by that was like PayPal already existed when Stripe came along, but one of the big issues was it wasn't super developer friendly. It was very widget based, so you kind of know as a user that you're in like a not very like nice custom UI when you're using PayPal, versus Stripe can be embedded very natively. So like Shopify does that, DoorDash, Uber, Airbnb, et cetera. So it feels like you're still in the app. And those are a lot of the same core frustrations that we had with the Auth0 Oktas of the world that we were trying to bring to market with Stytch.
That is very interesting. Like, it's like a problem that most people don't think about. But when the analogy you gave about Stripe, it all makes sense. Like, it was kind of like a design problem.
Yes.
And like I remember like Stripe's thesis was eventually the decision makers are going to be developers.
Yep.
To some extent. And I believe like that's like very like core thesis of like Stytch as well.
Yes, certainly. And that developers want control, they want ease, and they also want the latest and greatest when it comes to like modern architectures for authentication.
Sure. So, I mean, you talked about data breaches, and I get all of these notifications from Apple saying that these 50 passwords were like breached in the latest like data breach. You should like change all of them, and I'm like, that is so terrible. Like I have to go and change passwords every single website, which is just frustrating.
Or go ahead. But I was gonna say that the danger there is like, to your point, it's a lot of friction and almost no user does go change those passwords after they get alerted. So that was the risk we saw. Was it makes sense when users have to manage 150 plus passwords online that people choose a couple that work for all of the conditions. Like you've got to have, a special symbol, you've got to have a number, you have to have a capital letter. So people choose one or two that work. And then at that point, unfortunately, your security is just connected to the weakest link in the chain of like, how does Best Buy safeguard that password? Which is unfortunate because Chase does a much better job. But if you're using the same password and it gets breached at Best Buy, now it can be used and kind of speared against you by moving over to the other property.
Even Google Chrome to some extent. Like a lot of people save their passwords in Chrome, and I'm sure like these extensions that we're downloading, like there has to be some way that people are figuring out to like breach passwords there.
Yep. No, I think that's right. There are extensions, like a lot of extensions that people download give you a lot of kind of freedom on the browser level and the JavaScript level. And so I wouldn't be surprised. I don't see that many active incidents around that type of abuse, but it would be a very likely abuse vector.
That's interesting. So you had a background with Plaid, and you were facing this problem that we're integrating like Chase and Bank of America and like Wells Fargo, and people are forgetting their passwords. So we need better auth. And then you realize the existing players like Auth0, I think you mentioned, they're just like not working.
Yeah, because we were effectively, I mentioned there was kind of the two issues that we cared about. One was increasing conversion because we only got paid when you successfully connected a bank account. The second one was reducing account takeover. So like we didn't want when somebody's Best Buy account got stolen for that to imperil their Chase account or their Bank of America account. And we found both of those issues were happening. And we actually had two different teams. I was the PM for both, but we had two different engineering teams. One focused on conversion, the other one focused on fraud risk. And there's a light bulb a couple quarters into working on those projects that the culprit was the same in both scenarios. Like all of the drop off and conversion loss was people forgetting their password, or almost all of it was. And then most of the account takeover was also people reusing passwords. So we have this archaic way that we authenticate ourselves online that it dates back all the way to the 60s, but obviously the 90s is when it became prolific with consumers. And it's just, if we have things like biometrics built into our devices, if we have more secure email clients, if we have phone verification, et cetera, there just had to be better ways to do it. And when we tried building those into Plaid and we tried using solutions like Auth0, AWS Cognito, Okta, we were pretty alarmed at how architected those solutions were for like 2005 versus 2020. And so that was where a lot of the inspiration for Stytch came from, which was how do we provide the modern approach to customer identity and authentication for the next decade.
Interesting. I mean, what we have seen in like 2010, 2020 is focus on design has been like the big thing. Like people are trying to embed things rather than like have like a standalone page. And I think that's where like Stytch like differentiated that we're going to embed in your workflow and it's going to seem like you're doing it.
I think that's exactly right. Like that was certainly what we were trying to do at Plaid, and frustrated that we couldn't do with someone like an Auth0. So I think that matters a lot. Like you have to stand out more from a UI perspective on the web now because there are so many different sites. I think the other piece, though, also comes down to standing out, and also how you think about architecting a system, is that in 2008, when I believe Okta was founded, really there was like one primary way that you authenticated online, that was usernames and passwords. You didn't really get widespread like mass adoption 2FA until a few years later when you start getting like programmatic SMS so that you could do SMS one-time passcodes. Obviously, you get things like SendGrid, and you can do programmatic email verification. You get things like biometrics a couple years later when Apple released Face ID. And you always had, even amongst this time, you had things like YubiKeys and you had RSA keys, but those were a very select percentage of people. It was like very, kind of, people that were deep in tech, professionals that were using that. And so Okta was pretty much architected for a very simple username password based authentication scheme. And over the next decade, you get this proliferation of different options that now it's not just integrating with a read write of your database. It's also integrating with third-party protocols for biometrics or OAuth, or SAML or things like that. And so that's where the complexity gets increased. But you're right that it's also this UI component of not just do I want to own my auth, but also I want to provide a better auth experience to users because I'm competing against every other Airbnb lookalike if I'm VRBO, or if like real estate apps are a great example of this. There's like a handful of top real estate apps, right? Like Zillow, Redfin, Realtor.com. They all use the same auth methods. The reason for that is like if you go to their sites, they'll use things like Google One Tap, which is a very custom specific auth method, which recognizes you have a logged in Chrome session or Google session and just like is one tap for you to like continue moving. It's even better than signing with Google from a conversion standpoint. And you realize like in the 2010s, as you're competing for every margin of percentage increase in conversion, those things start to matter, especially because it's not just conversion, it's also customer experience, whether they think your brand is modern versus old, and then also the security component, where you want to make sure users' passwords aren't being stolen and then reused for abuse of those accounts.
Very interesting. I mean, I'm assuming that the churn part that happens for a lot of brands, especially for us as well, it happens at the auth part. Like I've seen a lot of companies say we didn't do auth, like there was no login bay and like we had like massive user base. The minute we started doing authentication, it dropped massively. And then we improved it. And then it's not as high, but it's still like higher. And I think that's like making it frictionless, the experience of using it while still keeping it safe.
Absolutely. It's interesting, like take something like a password reset, where there's some great data on this, especially in the e-commerce vertical where it's studied a lot, that when you choose as a user, like reset my password because you forgot what your password is and you can't get into the app, maybe you're on a new device that didn't have the password saved, of users that choose that option and go down that funnel, 75% do not complete the action. So they may request it and then be like, I don't want to go through this 5-minute process. They may request it, then go to their email and then decide like, oh, I'm distracted, I'm looking at another email now. They may go all the way to their email, click on the button, and then see that they have to enter a new password and confirm it, and see that the app doesn't support autofill. And so you're like, oh, now I have to create this 14-character password on mobile and I'm fat fingering it, and they'll abandon there. But like, it's crazy when you think about that. Like, if just presume, like, take your application, say, what percentage of my users do I think are going to forget their password per month? Is it 10%? That's probably a little bit high. Typically, we see it's in like the 5 to 7%. But let's say it's 10% because you're an app that has users who use it on mobile and desktop, so they're naturally moving without a password manager that's natively integrated. If that's the case, you're churning 7.5% of your active user base per month just because there's too much friction at the password reset. And I think that matters. Obviously, password reset matters way more as you get to scale and you're caring a lot more about retention. But to your point, also the sign up piece matters a lot too. The one thing I would say is you probably always presume some drop off when you put any type of gating like auth in place. And that's both natural because it takes out some of the users that are just browsing and are like least interested in taking action, which is fine. But also you do have to think about there are a lot of bots that are likely you think are real users that are actually just bots until you actually put auth in place and start to discern what is a real human versus a bot.
But I'm sure like it helps in a lot of ways. Like one, who's actually a user, and two, you can differentiate bots. So you can stop spam attacks or like a lot of those things that happen with like bots coming in.
Exactly. And that was actually one of the big things that we wanted to do differently, in addition to other pieces I talked about, like, customization, modern approaches like passwordless, et cetera, is that we built bot detection into the platform. And part of that experience comes from the fact that, like, when we worked at Plaid, Plaid was someone that was, always dealing with bot attacks on our API endpoints. And we learned to get very mature and kind of very precise in how we would identify whether it was a good user or it was a bad user, either a bad manual user or a bad bot that was trying to abuse the interface. And when we tried using other solutions like Auth0, Okta, et cetera, we realized they ask you to go either build all of that yourself, which usually you're not a fraud expert, or go buy another, like, often it's large five or low six figures for another or another fraud provider, like a really, bot resistant CAPTCHA solution or a device fingerprinting solution. And that was one of the things that we wanted to do differently, is that we figure if you're going to be charging people for a front door with a deadbolt and it's a premium product that they're buying because they want a great experience, you should probably sell a security system on top of that too, because and it should be integrated because people want to know if somebody's trying to unlock the door with a stolen key, or whether it's a fabricated key from a locksmith or something like that. And so that was a lot of the ethos early on as well.
It's like a part of the process. Like security is like a part of authentication that other players were not doing, and that's like an opportunity. You saw that. Okay, this is big.
Exactly.
So working at Plaid, you and your co-founder worked there together, and she was doing Auth at a separate company after that, and you guys met for coffee, and like, let's go, like boom, like this is like the next big thing. But getting that idea and getting that thesis to building an MVP, getting a client, raising some money, like walk me through that process. Like, how was that like once you were like, okay, this is what we want to do?
Yeah, so we were very interested in doing this as of December 2019, but we spent about another 6 months before we left our jobs because we were trying to validate the idea, see if we could get interested, pilot customers, et cetera. And so what we did was, I'd say between December 2019 and May, when we gave notice to our employers, we likely did something like 40 to 50 kind of discovery calls with developers where it was focused on current solution. So whether they're using Auth0, Google Firebase, AWS Cognito, insert any auth provider, trying to understand what they liked about it, what they disliked, what their propensity was to switch if there was a better solution, what would be, like how would they react to different solution features that we might provide out of the box, et cetera. And with each of those, we were trying to figure out like, is there there? Like, is this the right thing for us to go build, or is this an exhausted market? And what we found was we kept getting higher conviction with every, additional call that we had, to the point that we just looked at each other and said, we've got to go build this. And so that was in the spring when that was happening. And so Juliana was building the POC. I mentioned she's an engineer by trade. I'm not an engineer by background, though I can build a few dumb web scrapers. And so she built the POC. We started putting it in front of a few people. And obviously it was very early, like you wouldn't run it in production at this point, but they could see the docs, they could start playing around with the API. And that's when we started talking to people about like LOIs, like letters of intent. Effectively, like, would you buy this if this was available on market in production? We understand it is not right now, but would you buy it? And as we started signing those, that's when we got excited about going to raise a round. Like the thing for us was like, given the fact that we were, relatively, well, not relatively, very illiquid, like, 27-year-olds still, like, obviously we were, we hadn't had exits yet. Plaid was still a private company, et cetera. It was unlikely we were going to be able to bootstrap a company like this, where so much of it is critical infrastructure that you have to hire a really good platform and infra team, really good security engineers. And then obviously you have normal costs of sales, marketing, back end, front end, like just normal core parts of kind of building your business. So we went and raised a round in June. We raised around a $6 million seed round from Benchmark, led by Chetan Puttagunta, who sits on the board. And the reason we chose him and Benchmark was they really do have a great track record of partnering when you are like two people and trying, like, and obviously not everything goes to IPO, but like that is like what gets them most excited, is how do they go from the earliest kernel inception of an idea and traction and fund you. And they only do Series A's, like they only do Series A. They only do like that first check. But then how do they work with you to get to IPO through, both like product, go to market, also scaling into new fundraising rounds, et cetera. And so they've been a great partner since then.
So Benchmark, I mean, I hear it's like their goal is IPO. Like they're not looking for the small wins. Like they're looking to make like the next Uber, like the next, the next big company.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So you highlight a lot of things. So step number one was you get an idea, but then you're like, before taking that step of quitting your day jobs, you were like, okay, let's validate this.
Yep.
Talk to 40, 50 people, figure out more and more conviction that, okay, this is the thing that we want to go after. And then you start building a POC, put it out there, get LOIs, and you go out and raise money. So how difficult was that first process of raising money? Like, was it easy given that you're back from like Plaid, or was it still a hustle?
So we'd obviously put a lot of work behind it in terms of investigation, POC. We put a lot of work into the deck, and I think that's an underrated part of like, it's like, how do you, like, storytelling is what it is at the end of the day at a seed stage. There's not enough data or insights to say this is going to be a successful or unsuccessful company, just from that input. And so we spent a lot of time on it. I will say, like, it was, a month or two into the pandemic, the market had bounced back after the initial pandemic like hangover. And so it was a pretty strong VC market. And we were coming from, I think, a background that they were excited to invest in, which was like API, working at an API company, taking an API first approach to a large TAM problem like authentication. And so I'll never say it was not easy to raise, because there was a lot of work that went into it, and we had to pitch, 30 investors. But at the end of the day, we did have a lot of term sheets, and I feel fortunate that here's really what I credit. I think people really hate passwords. Like, I think this is like an oversimplification, but I think it was visceral that, like, obviously we're building a product for engineers,
Yeah.
but even VCs that were not engineers were human and had felt the frustration of like dropping off because of something, like, or the security issue with passwords. And so I think there was both, we had the right team, I think we had the right idea, but also I think some ideas resonate even with the non-buyer
On tech.
ways that are valuable for how you pitch recruits, VCs, etc.
That is very interesting. Like I'd assume that as a VC, like if I get this pitch, I'd call up all of my companies and I'd be like, would you buy this? Because
Yeah.
like this is the problem that mostly every company probably faces. That is
And,
very interesting. That is very interesting.
and I do think that's a component of it, because I will say some of the best VCs we worked with, like, I thought they did something very smart. They actually introduced us to their portfolio companies
Yeah.
to pitch
Yeah.
them. And then
Okay.
they asked for reviews from the portfolio companies on, would you buy this? What do you think of their salesmanship? Does their product like vision align with like where you want to go? And it was good for them because they both got, good credit from us for like being good partners and introducing us to potential customers, but also allowed them to get more data points and signal into whether they wanted to fund us.
Sure. And even for their portfolio companies, it's like a better solution for them if they buy
Yeah,
it.
exactly.
Very interesting. So okay, so December happens, 6 months, all of that happens. You get the first check, and now you're like, let's build this platform out better, and like let's actually get clients. So what was the journey like from the first check, $6 million benchmark, good VC, good money, to raising like the latest round and building the big business you've built?
Yeah. So the first thing we did actually after we got the money in the bank was hit the hiring trail really hard. And we didn't want to like overhire, but we wanted a team of like 6 to 7 people that would fill the gaps that we had. So we knew we needed platform and infra, as I mentioned. We knew we needed security engineering. Obviously, you need backend engineers to build a great API product and a scalable API product. And then we need the front end so that we could build the doc site, the dashboard, the marketing site. And I mentioned that because we had the POC, we had these LOIs, but a vast majority of our time in that first month post closing the round was in hiring. And I think it's one of the things that our investor Chatham says is, go slow to go fast, which is like, what is the thing that is highest leverage that you maybe wish that you were building the features right now over this month, but if you end up with like 6 to 7 great fits on your team at the end of a month, you'll be going way faster in those ensuing 6 months than if you were building the features and hiring those 6 people over the course of the next 6 months.
Yeah.
And so how do you choose those high leverage plays and invest in them disproportionately in order to allow you to go slow, maybe right at first, but then go much faster as it scales? And so we did that. Then we had a beta that was available for early beta customers, LOI partners, et cetera, about 3 or 4 months after that, which is kind of graduating the POC into something that was production ready. There are a lot of things we had to do to improve the docs experience, the dashboard experience, et cetera. And so we went live with that. First thing that we did was we took a page out of Stripe's book where we did these things called, user integration interviews, which is like us just on Zoom with people as they're integrating, taking friction logs of like anything that confused them about the docs or about something they expected to be here or there, and figuring out how to incorporate that into the product, which then led us to opening up a public beta a couple months later after we incorporated a lot of those improvements. Then I want to say that we released self-serve 6 months later, and where we actually, right after we announced public beta and started launching that and started seeing kind of like the growth on just like the kind of like the untapped demand for a product like this and the interest in it, was where Thrive led our Series A. The Series B was not led until about a year later, after we'd started to first like go up market. And so we had started signing our first enterprise customers. So we had a large self-serve PLG base, but as we started to unseat like pretty large incumbents and also in-house systems, and you started to see like those 6-figure contract values, that was when there was a lot of excitement for the Series B.
That is very interesting. So I mean, see it happens May, June, and then it takes about 2 years from Series A to Series B, and you keep proving data points.
Yep.
So building a solid product, but first building a team.
Yep.
And that is very much, I was hearing like Rex's story before, and it's very similar to that, where like they hired a CFO as the first hire, which is usually like happens a couple months down the line.
Yep.
So building like a solid team first, and something that benchmark like emphasized on. So I know like you come from like a product background, and Juliana comes from like more technical background, like probably software engineering. How do you think about, or like at that time post seed, how did you think about developing Stytch's product, and how has that philosophy changed now? Like, what are like the 3 things or 4 things you focus on when you're like building a product?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think the first one is always get a ton of customer feedback on what they want and what they're looking for. I think the other pieces that are less science, like, because I think that's a science, like how you collect information, how you ask people questions, what types of questions elicit the right responses versus which are self-affirming, and so therefore maybe less valuable. But sometimes you are looking to self-affirm something, but you just need to figure out the right way to actually phrase it. There's like a lot of just like science and psychology around like how you ask those questions, how you pull out the right information. The art, I think, behind it though about building a product is there are certainly things that, like, it's kind of the Henry Ford quote of, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse rather than a car. And so it's like, what are the things, one, that people actually would really love, but is not within their mental framework or scaffolding to say, I want that, because it's just novel and they're asking for something that looks the same, but is slightly better in some capacity. And then two, there's a quote I heard from another CEO that I thought was funny, which was buyers are liars. And what they meant was like, a lot of times buyers will say they want X or Y, but really what they want is Z. And always getting to the root of why they're asking for something, because they might be asking for better like fraud visibility dashboard. But really what like our perspective is like, yes, like you should get that dashboard. I know you want visibility into this, but really like, why do you have two engineers that are looking at a fraud dashboard all the time? It's because your vendor is not taking care of this for you, right? So like, why do you want this integration with this other fraud third party? It's because like you have an auth vendor that has taught you that it is normal that you should have to deal with all like that whack-a-mole. And so it's like, how do you figure out not just like really great research, but what are they not asking for, but they would want? And then what are those pieces that, they say they want something, but it's actually a different root cause that they need.
That XYZ analogy basically just hit me pretty hard. Because I'm thinking about, and especially that engineering thing, a lot of the times when you're like asking questions, people will be like, the current player that we have is giving us this, which is good, but like, what if we also had this feature? But as a product guy, you're thinking, you probably don't even need that if you solve the problem before that, which no one is looking into. And as a customer, I'm not even thinking about it, that this problem can be solved because no one has done that.
That's it's a great point. And honestly, it's one of the things that's harder to learn, I think, as somebody that didn't come from a sales background, of like, how do you dig into that appropriately? And I was talking to our head of sales actually earlier today, and they mentioned, and they've been here for over a year, and they mentioned the biggest way they've noticed the way that I sell on calls has changed is that when I used to get questions from customers, I would just like give them 100% answer. I'd be like, here's how. Oh, that's because like, can you do X or Y? Like I'd give them the full answer. And he's like, now I notice that a lot of the time you say, oh, why do you ask that? Or like, what are you looking for there? And like, that was something that was not as, it is like natural for a PM to dig into that, but like sales feels like such a, there's something theatric around it that like when I first came into like selling like founder-led sales, I felt like you just had to answer every single question, and you should give people all of the information they're asking for. But it is that question of like, oh, you want a faster horse? Why is that? Oh, I want to actually be able to go from this part of town to that part of town faster. Now let me think about the actual solutions that don't require a faster horse, or tell you why, Z thing, as we're talking about, is actually what you're looking for.
That's a very refreshing insight in terms of digging deep on the why. Like, why are they asking this? Like, what's the root problem? Like, what are they trying to solve? More than what exactly do they need? So you talk about like gathering user feedback and like incorporating that into like the product development cycle. What's the science? What would you say is like the top 2-3 ways you've figured out to be like the best ways of gathering like bias-free user feedback that you can give to the product?
Yeah, so I'd say one has to do with the conversations that you have, and the others probably have to be how you track them and keep yourselves accountable to them. So the first on like how you have the conversations, I would say never lead the witness, right? This is something you hear in like the legal realms, like don't lead the witness and take them down the path you want them to go down. At that point, you already have a preconceived notion of the feature you're going to build or the product you're going to build. You have to start at the root problem and get as much context there as possible. And then also show them iterations of what you're exploring and let them react to it. But you do need to make sure that you're not asking questions so in a way that it like tease you up for what's already in your mind. And maybe that's okay when you're 50 calls in, but if you're 3 to 5 calls in, the N is so small that every single one of affirmation or dissent from what you're building matters a lot. So don't lead the witness, because you need those data points. And then I would say like there's some really great tooling out there that founders should be using to capture and then record and then like continue to hold themselves accountable for the customer feedback they're getting. Gong is one of my favorite tools. Obviously, lots of people use it, but it allows you to record all these Zoom calls that you're on. And it's the most powerful thing I've found for creating empathy on the engineering team for what customers and prospects are asking for. But also sometimes somebody's asking for something that I don't have technical expertise in. So I need to send it to that security engineer so that they can actually see how they're asking it, get to the root of why, versus doing a back and forth email thread that doesn't get answered, or Slack thread, or something where it unravels. And so I found Gong is for recording is super helpful. You can also set alerts now that we have a sales team for when certain comments come up, so that I know when somebody asks for passkeys, which is like a biometric based authentication type. And then I can monitor how people are talking about that, synthesize it, send it to our team. The other piece is that we pipe all of that into Linear then as like feature requests, so that we can review on a consistent basis the number of customers and the associated ARR with different requests and what people are asking for.
And this also helps you prioritize that, these 7-figure customers or 6-figure customers like request these top 3 things. So let's focus this quarter on like building these top 3 things in the product and getting it.
Yeah.
I'm sure you get so much feedback and you're like, I cannot build everything. I need to like prioritize like these 3 things at the top and then go down. So Dong, you said? D-O-N-G, Dong?
G-O-N-G, Gong. Like hitting a gong or something.
Gong. Okay, Gong and then Linear for like product management. That's very interesting. So anyone who's looking at this, that's like the stack that you use. So the bigger picture is of Stytch's passwordless authentication. That's where you're trying to get to. And the team knows that, okay, you want to get to passwordless authentication. But I think we touched upon this a little while back, is that companies still use passwords.
Yeah.
A lot of companies probably still prefer using passwords. When you're talking to them, ideally you'd like to pitch that that's not the best way. You probably want to do biometrics or something else. And you're sort of also like kind of like a consulting company as well, like as a startup, because you're trying to change the process. How do you balance that? Like, how do you tell them that this is new, but then also adapt to their existing workflows?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the key thing for us is we always talk about meeting customers where they are, but showing them where they could go, but not forcing them to go there. And what I mean by that is, for us, you're right that so many of our enterprises and our like customers that are migrating from an Auth0 or an Okta, they may be excited about a passwordless future, but they're afraid to go cold turkey on passwords. Like they know, hey, so much of our UX is kind of like today on the presumption that you have a password. Oh, will my customer demographic understand that they don't need a password? Will that be confusing to them? And every quarter, you chip away actually at the number of like people coming with that framing, but you're always going to have that framing, and it's a reasonable framing to have when there's a new way of doing something that's coming up. And so for us, as we built out the platform, we obviously didn't want to architect ourselves like an Auth0 or Okta for just passwords as like the primary building block. We wanted to build in passwordless as a first-class citizen, but realize there's a bridge to passwordless where most large companies that have the largest impact on the number of users we touch and our ARR are going to be companies that are not ready to fully deprecate it. They're going to say, let me still use passwords as an option, but then let me add on biometrics, or let me add on Google as an option, or let me add on email magic links as an option. And so we make it really clear we can meet you where you are, but hey, here, let us paint a vision for where you can go. And here's how easy it is that if you just want to migrate your current password system to us, that's great. If a week later you want to add email magic links as a secondary option or as an alternative, or you want to add biometrics, great, that's a line of code. Let's do that. There's a little bit, maybe you update something in the back end on your user table, but quite simple with Stytch. So we do that. And then I would say the big thing for us is always just like, we try, to your point about being consultants, we like monitor the data for our customers and we report back to them so that they understand what's working and what's not. And so as an example, we'll see most of these companies are like, oh, I can't give up passwords. Like, lots of our customers want it, et cetera. They've never actually had great data insight into the auth methods that their users choose, because that's not something that their team has put a lot of analytics around. And so they'll migrate to us, and immediately they'll start getting these monthly reports from us. We're like, hey, did you notice that of your, you're offering 4 different options here. You're offering sign in with Google, email magic link, email one-time passcode, and passwords. Sign in with Google is 70% of your traffic. Email magic link is 15%. Email one-time passcode is 10%. 5% of your traffic is actually choosing passwords, which is like, we're not saying like throw away those 5%. Maybe you still want to serve them, but it's good for you to know as a customer that a lot of your users are voting with their feet per se. Yeah. And they're choosing passwordless. And so we find that's interesting. And then we also will tell them, we have this other customer that just integrated Google One Tap and saw registration rates double or 3x or something like that. So you should try that and put it on these pages. And then they'll do it. And then often they'll see actually their password option rate goes down like 2% or something like that. So we'll work with them on kind of iterating over time. But the big thing is always meeting them where they are. Because when somebody's doing a massive tech migration, you don't want to introduce the concept of like lots of changes. You want to first do migration like for like, and then give them the value of being on a better platform.
To go from like one block to the other and like slowly like expand like to the ideal way it should be.
Yeah,
that's very interesting. And meeting where the customer you are is probably like more like a sales tactic in a way, that you don't want to scare them off with like too much change. So you're like, we'll solve one problem. We can solve 10, but let's start with one, and then let's sort of like grow from there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah, that sort of like gives a very unique insight to me in terms of how you think about product, and which was just like great learning. Next, I would like to understand, what do you think is the intersection of like AI and authentication? Like, are you guys using AI right now? I know like there's a big bubble of AI going on. Is that a part of it, or like is that not?
Yeah. So I'll first to the question of whether we're using AI, which is probably less interesting to the real answer of how I think it will impact authentication is we use it at the company to a minimum amount right now. Our support team uses it. They've trialed a few different like pilot products of somebody has a question that can be answered by the docs or previous guides we've written. How do we surface that as a draft to our support team so they can consider whether it's accurate, rank it, downvote it, and then use what they like or what they don't like? And I'd say it's still very early stages. It's like pretty rudimentary in terms of what we're finding in terms of performance. And so clearly, it can't be on autopilot right now is how I describe it. But what I think is much more interesting from like an authentication lens is we do expect AI, and in particular AI agents, to have a large impact on how we authenticate. And the example I often use for people is like, think about the movie Her, which is like one of the more prominent examples of AI, where you have Joaquin Phoenix talking to this earpiece and it taking actions on his behalf, right? Like he says, can you delete all my emails that don't have action required? And it, scans through his entire Gmail and then deletes everything that's not important, analyzes for him, and then provides him a report. And if you think about that, you are providing both read and write access to that AI agent that is combing through your email. It's not so different than saying, now go book me a vacation, or go pay my bills, or go do any other thing that is tedium today that we use our browsers, which are user agents today. Any of those are plausible that they could be replaced by AI agents in the future. Yeah. Where like right now, the browser as a user agent is I am physically present and I take actions based on this UI presented to me. With AI agents, the next kind of like step or like that graduation that would be interesting to see, and I think it's coming. I just don't know. I don't think any of us know how quickly it will get here from like a performant and widely adopted standpoint. Is when can I just use an interface, whether it's chat or audio, and me giving an objective to an AI agent means it can go accomplish things for me that otherwise would have required me individually to authenticate. And so the reason that's really exciting is now you have this new paradigm where like humans can log in, but so can your AI agent. And so now when you're logging your Bank of America, it does require different access management, right? Because like you might not want your AI agent to have access to everything, because maybe you're like, this is early technology. I don't want it to be able to send $10,000. I want it to be able to send $100. Exactly. And maybe the websites, like the apps, are going to be pretty skeptical at first, right? Because they're going to say like, the audit trails on these are going to be a nightmare. Like, how do we actually audit whether like he really asked it to do this, or if it went off the chains and it did something by accident? So that's going to be a big component. And the other piece with authentication that I think matters a lot is phishing resistant authentication has to become critical for everyone, because now it's so trivial to replicate somebody's voice or their tone in an email, or create with ChatGPT really believable phishing campaigns, that now like what matters in that world is like the reason you have phishing with things like SMS passcodes, email passcodes, passwords, is those are all authentication methods where you can forward along the claim to someone else that can then use that claim to get into your account. And the thing we're most bullish on there for phishing resistance is built-in biometrics to devices like Touch ID, Face ID, where you can only provide and perform the cryptographic signing and verification on the same device. And it requires it to look like Bhavye or sound like Bhavye, whatever type of biometric you're using that's device tied. And so that's where we get excited about some of the defenses against the new fraud angles we're going to see in authentication. But I think from a non-fraud standpoint, AI agents are really the piece where you start to see authentication get credibly changed in an AI-based world.
That is so interesting. So I don't know if you've tried AutoGPT. It's
Yep.
like it's not there yet, but I can see it becoming like that's also like what Flow is betting on. That agents become popular, people build agents with us. But agents, like I know ChatGPT lets you like order like on Instacart or something right now.
Yep.
It's a fun tool. It's not there yet, but it will be. And I'm wondering that Instacart is tied up to my Amex credit card. Every time I use Instacart, it auto pays from my Amex card. So if someone can technically access my Instacart like an agent, they can also access my Amex to some extent and make this, which is a big security issue. Because Instacart is just one of the things. Someone can book like flights and hotels and all those things. And if agents will do this, like let's say 2 years down the line, like a whole new security system needs to be built. That is it an AI? Is it a human? If it's an AI or if it's an agent, did I authorize it or like someone else authorized it? And then chargebacks become like a big thing. So it's like it's pretty messy, and it's very interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah, it's actually, even outside of this podcast, we should probably chat between Stytch and Flow
Yeah,
GPT about ways to coordinate, because we are talking with a number of different providers that are going to be impacted either on the AI agent building side or the other's perspective of
yeah,
what does this new authentication model look like?
yeah,
Because it is something that, I think is coming. I think it's going to take a little bit. Your point is Auto GPT is right. Like that is a great example. It's obviously not there yet, but it's a great example of where you could go that allows for these agents that can be prompted with objectives rather than parameters of what to do.
yeah,
And so one of the things I think is interesting is like we're going to live in a world where like with ChatGPT, you have these plugins like Instacart, which is effectively a regulated AI agent, right?
yeah,
It's really just like an API integration from ChatGPT, which allows for some pretty interesting use cases. And it's very cool. But I think what you're going to see is like a lot of unregulated AI agents where like say that you don't have an API being exposed by the application, is that going to stop users or the builders of these AI agents from interacting with that application? No, I think developers are realizing like, why don't I just build a data scraper that can take actions on behalf of the user? Why don't I just use headless browsing? And so therefore I get past the bot detection and I know I'm doing it like with the user's permission. So it's not illegal. It's just like whether I can get past the bot prevention. So you're going to end up with like regulated AI agents, unregulated AI agents. Some proportion of unregulated AI agents are going to be good bots or like well-intended bots. Some are going to be bad. And you're right that the security risk matters for all of them of like, it almost becomes more like a B2B authentication problem where
yeah,
think about it, when you for FlowGPT sign up for a linear account or an Atlassian account, you
yeah,
decide you're the admin and maybe one of your employees is like a member, maybe one's a support member, maybe one of them's a developer.
yeah,
You're creating all these admin and role-based access controls, and every consumer app is going to need the exact same support, but for this concept of like the human, like the true human Bhavye, and then also your permitted AI agents and their different permissions that they're allowed to take, and whether you want step up MFA for them, where like it's trying to move $500. Do you want to require face biometric at this point?
yeah, yeah.
So it's really fascinating. Like that to me, it's one of the more fascinating what happens here questions that I think lots of stuff will happen, and it's anyone's guess how quickly and the exact way that it transforms. But that's my best guess.
That is very interesting. Like, if and you bring up Her, like the movie. So I can technically be talking to, let's say, Siri, like on my AirPods, and I can be, and it's sort of like I'm prompting like an agent saying that, like in a professional setting, you bring up linear, I can be like, oh, I was on a call with this one. Siri, why don't you send this data from this app to this person? Now, what's very interesting is how do you authenticate that? Like, is this going to be, is this like fraudulent or not? Which is like the big thing. And you bring up non-API access, something very similar to what Plaid did. Like all banking was not open, and Plaid just
Yep.
kind of like scraped it, which was like gray area of like legality. So that is going to be and it is, I think, more than a developing issue, it is definitely like a big security issue.
Yep.
So
Yep.
do you guys see yourself like Stytch, like sort of like hopping out of that once it's there, like building something in that space?
Yeah, so we've actually already been working on a number of these things kind of in the background. And one of the reasons we're working with a lot of providers that we think are either going to be at the cutting edge or early impacted is trying to figure out like to the point we discussed earlier, like what do you want on there's two sides to this, right? If you are building AI agents, what do you want this protocol to look like? How do you want to plug in to apps? How do you want to like, because you don't want to build a headless browser for everything that you're going to go access. You want some permitted route, and maybe you'll deal with a headless browser for anyone that's too slow to adopt it. But if you're an application, you also want a permitted route because you don't want to serve UI to all these AI agents and just
Yeah,
have them, creating Byzantine ways to get around it, because
yeah,
you want to know, is this the real AI agent that Bhavye previously permissioned? So you
yeah,
want to do like some type of, it's almost like machine-to-machine authentication there, but not internal services. It's external service versus like your applications, almost like issuing an API key for you, right? Which is what's happening on the like when
when a developer is accessing it.
yeah, when an app is trying to allow access to it. And then they're going to want to know, they're going to want access controls for it. They're going to want to know if it's a good AI agent or a bad one.
Yeah,
So some of these things have already been built into our product, like the bot detection, which
yeah,
allows us to help people give apps the knobs for detecting it. But I think there's a lot more to do on the actual data model on user management and access controls, and also this actual, how does your AI agent successfully prove it's your AI agent securely in that exchange? And so those are the components we're working with folks on.
even like as a security issue, I think, if an AI agent is given the access of like accessing an API, I'm sure that companies would be skeptical of like how much does the AI agent actually access that, and like is
Yep.
there any potential of like reverse engineering, like data breaches that they can do, which is like another big mess they've
Yep.
got to solve.
Yep.
That's very interesting. That, I mean, I feel like I can just like keep talking to you about authentication because I never thought about it this way. and it's way more interesting, and it's way bigger of a problem that people think. And AI is actually going to make it more complex, like way more
Yep.
complex than it was. But yeah, I mean, I think we're almost done with the time. But any final thoughts you have, like any advice, insights for new startup founders, people looking to build some cool things?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think as we talked about, there's a lot of exciting things in this AI space, even industries that you thought were like ossified. Like and authentication wasn't ossified, right? Because you're getting new methods like biometrics, but like there's a tried and true way to do it. There's a wrong way to do it. Like you might have thought that industry had kind of everything had been kind of solved.
Yeah.
AI is introducing all these paradigm shifts in like how we interact with apps, how we interact with software. What does it mean to be a consumer of software, a builder of software? And so I would just say, as people are young, if they're looking to go deep into an industry, I haven't seen a better industry in terms of like just how many things can be rethought with these capabilities. But also, I would say take a pragmatic lens to it of like, how do you pressure test those things? Like, I'm very excited about this AI agent world. I'm also worried about it from a security perspective, but I think there's a massive question mark on how quickly it gets here. And so I need to think about that as a CEO of the right amount of resources to invest in. Like, I'm invested in it because it's the type of thing that could kill our company if login flows go away and it's just AI agents talking to other APIs, and everything becomes an API with an AI agent interaction versus a UI interaction. But obviously, I think it's credible enough that we need to think about it, but it's not right on our doorstep. So there's some amount of like work you do. But anyways, I would just say be pragmatic, pressure test things, figure out how to like, establish your own truths around that, or predictions around that. And then I would just say if people are curious about any of these topics that we've talked about so far, reach out to me on LinkedIn or Twitter. On Twitter, I'm McStempel, McStempel, and I love to chat more with people that are kind of tinkering around in this area and making sure that we're building the best auth platform we can for kind of this new age of AI.
Wonderful. I'll put in the links, LinkedIn and Twitter, in the description for anyone to like text read. Definitely, like there are probably thousands of things that can be unpacked here that we didn't unpack in this episode. But thank you so much, Reed, for joining us. Really appreciate it. A lot of great insights. And thank you everyone who's listening.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Perfect, perfect.